The Uprisings in the Jewish Diaspora. Chapter 3 of the Cambridge Handbook to Judaism, Volume 4. Article written by Miriam Pucci Ben-Ziv. 1. Unrest among the Jews of the Diaspora. Towards the end of Trajan's reign, violent Jewish uprisings erupted in several places in the Mediterranean world. The reasons that led the Jews to take up arms are difficult to grasp, since they are not mentioned by the sources that deal more with the fighting of wars than with their causes. However, a general ferment prevailed at the time among the Jews, caused by the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, and by the demeaning Fiscus Judaicus, which compelled all Jews to pay an annual poll tax to the Roman state. Such works as the Third Sibylline Oracle, for Ezra, and 2 Baruch insist on an upheaval of the present political situation, on the coming of the Messiah, the destruction of the wicked, the ingathering of the exiles, the restoration of the Jewish state, and the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. It may be no accident that the Jews armed themselves while Trajan was busy with his war against the Parthians, a war that had begun in 114, and the results of which still appeared uncertain. The causes of this uprising also included local factors. This fact is evident concerning Egypt, where social, economical, political, and ideological competition and rivalry between Jews and Greeks are attested since the 3rd century BCE. The situation had become more tense in Roman times, and twice earlier in Trajan's days. In 112 and in the summer of 115, armed attacks had been perpetrated by Greeks against Jews, the last of which may definitely be considered a direct cause of the Jewish uprising. 2. As for Libya, the unrest that had occurred in 73 CE, which ended with the death and confiscation of property of a large number of wealthy Jews, may have weakened the number and the restraining authority of the wealthier members of local Jewish communities, paving the way for the most extreme ones. 2. The uprisings in Libya, Egypt, and Cyprus. A. Libya, led by Andreas, according to Dio/Xiphilinus, or by Lucuas, according to Eusebius, either 2 different persons or 1 person with 2 names, a common practice at the time. The Jews attacked their Greek and Roman neighbors. To Lucuas, Eusebius ascribes the title king, a fact that has led scholars to assume that the uprising had a messianic background. The evidence, however, is scarce. The account of Dio, which attributes shockingly violent and cruel behavior to the Jews, has often been taken at face value, but it should be considered against the background of the well-established tradition concerning the description of revolts by barbarians against the Roman establishment. The atrocities attributed to the Jews by Dio are no more striking than the ones he attributes to the Britons when they were revolting against the Romans in 61 CE, or to the Bucoli, who revolted in Egypt in 171 CE. Apart from rhetorical exaggerations, the epigraphical material attests attacks directed against temples, statues of gods, and centers of Greek civic life. In the city of Cyrene, in the sanctuary of Apollo, for example, the baths with the porticos, ball courts, and other neighboring buildings were destroyed and burnt down in the Jewish revolt. The temple of Hecate, too, was destroyed and burnt down in the Jewish revolt, and large destruction is also attested in the Caesareum and in the temple of Zeus. Possibly fearing that Roman military forces might arrive from the sea, the Jews tried to destroy the road connection between Cyrene and its port, Apollonia. A Hadrianic milestone commemorates the repair of the road, which had been overturned and smashed up in the Jewish revolt. Reynolds notes that at Balagri to the west an important sanctuary of Asclepius suffered severe damage. Moreover, a representation of a 7-branched candelabrum, deeply incised in the rock surface of a stretch of road, northwest of Balagri, suggests interference with the route between Cyrene and her neighbors to the west. Eusebius states that the Jews of Libya acted in cooperation with the Jews of Egypt, and specifically mentions a military alliance, adding that at a certain stage the Jews of Libya passed into Egypt. B. Egypt. Concerning the events transpiring in Egypt, papyrological evidence is available. Unfortunately, most of the papyri do not preserve the date, and the dates proposed in the CPJ rely on the incorrect assumption that CPJ 11435, written in October 115 and dealing with a Jewish-Greek conflict, is the starting point for the chronology of the Jewish revolt in Egypt. 6. On closer examination, however, it appears that this papyrus deals not with an uprising of Jews, but with an attack of Greeks perpetrated against the Jews. 7. The Jewish uprising, therefore, began later than October 115, which is also borne out by the ostraca found in the Jewish quarter of Apollonopolis Magna, from which one learns that the receipts for Jewish payment of various taxes halted at the end of May 116. Barnes is probably correct in arguing that this date must be the terminus post quern for the beginning of the Jewish uprising, at least at Apollinopolis Magna. 8. As for the terminus ante quem, it is the beginning of September, when, at Hermopolis, the wife of the strategos Apollonios, greatly worried, wrote the letter preserved in. The uprising covered large sections of the country. The Athrobite district, the vicinity of Memphis, a strategic center known for its anti-Semitism, the Phaeum, Oxyrhynchos, and the Heracleopolite Nome. Further south, the effects of fighting are recorded for the Kynopolite, the Hermopolite, as well as the Lycopolite and the Apollinopolite districts. Appian writes that during the events the shrine of Nemesis near Alexandria was destroyed by the Jews for the exigencies of the war, and Jewish attacks against pagan temples in Egypt and Cyrenaica may well account for the term impious Jews, which appears in the papyri. Appian, in Egypt at the time of the uprising, writes that the Jews seized the waterways, and similar information may be deduced from, and from a later Ethiopic source dealing with the fortress of Babylon. The Greeks retaliated, led by their strategoi, the best known as Apollonios at Apollinopolis Heptacomia, and were helped by the Egyptian peasants and the Romans. It appears that the prefect himself, Rutilius Lupus, personally participated in the engagements. Some of them must have been successful, as in the case of the victory and success of our Lord Apollonios in the vicinity of Memphis, recorded in CPJ 439. Since many of the Roman forces had been sent to fight with Trajan in Mesopotamia, however, the Roman military forces present in Loco, the Legio XXI Dioteriana, and a part of the Legio III Cyrenaica, were unable to restore order effectively. C. Cyprus. Dio states that the Jews rebelled in Cyprus, led by a certain Artemian, while in Eusebius Chronicon it is stated that the Jews attacked the pagan inhabitants of the island and destroyed Salamis. Epigraphical evidence is scarce, indirect, and difficult to interpret. The impression made by the revolt on the pagan and Christian sources is one of great destruction. Dio states that in Cyprus 240,000 perished, whereas Orosius writes that all the Greek inhabitants of Salamis were killed. D. Roman reaction. Against the Jews, Trajan sent Marcius Turbo with land and sea forces including cavalry. He waged war vigorously against them in many battles for a considerable time and killed many thousands of Jews, not only those of Cyrene but also those of Egypt. Marcius Turbo, one of Trajan's best generals, probably arrived as ducks with specific military functions. The additional forces who accompanied him may have included the cohors I Ulpia Aphorum Equitata and the coburs I Augusta Praetoria Lusitanorum Equitata, both of which are confirmed in Egypt in 117 C, the latter of which suffered heavy losses in Egypt during the early summer of 117. The Legio XXI Dioteriana and the Legio III Cyrenaica also fought against the Jews. We have the very names of a number of Roman legionaries belonging to these legions who were killed in combat. Moreover, from P. Hyde.lat, we learn about a plan for the mobilization of impressive military forces. The fleets from Misenum and Ravenna, the Legio III Cyrenaica, and additional auxiliary units, such as the cohors I Flavius Silicum Equitata. The harsh character of the Roman repression is attested by Appian, who states that in his day, Trajan exterminated the Jewish race in Egypt, and by the Jerusalem Talmud, which additionally emphasizes the destruction of the great Alexandrian synagogue, one of the glories of Egyptian Jewry. Turbo's military actions may have been fought in Libya as well, where during the war against the Jews, the Roman prefectus Castrorum, mentioned by Artemidoros Daldianus, was slain. To Cyprus Trajan sent another of his generals, Caius Valerius Rufus, tribune of the Upper Mosian Legion II Claudia. The military operations against the Jews in Cyprus may also underline the statement of the Babylonian Talmud that the blood of the Jews killed in Egypt reached as far as Cyprus. The uprising was certainly crushed before the autumn of 117 and possibly by summer, before the death of Trajan, since, immediately after his accession to the throne in August 117, Marcius Turbo was sent by Hadrian to Mauritania. At Oxyrhynchus, the victory over the Jews was commemorated by a festival that was still observed some 80 years later. Consequences. In Egypt and Libya, the Jews almost disappear from the sources after 117 C. In Egypt, the land that had belonged to the Jews was confiscated by the Roman government, and a consequence of the revolt may have been the abolition of the Jewish court at Alexandria. As for Cyprus, scholars have doubted the statement found in Dio that after the revolt, no Jew may set foot on that island, and even if one of them is driven upon the shores by a storm he is put to death. This statement is confirmed, though, by the epigraphical material, which provides no evidence of a Jewish presence on the island until the 4th century. In Egypt, agriculture suffered, slave labor and textiles were apparently in short supply, and signs of an economic crisis have been identified in unstable prices and a shortage of basic essentials such as bread. Damage to buildings, temples, and roads is attested by inscriptions, especially at Cyrene. According to Eusebius Chronicon, the cities of Salamis and Alexandria were completely destroyed, and Orosius states that, had Hadrian not later collected settlers from elsewhere and sent them to Libya to found colonies, the land would have remained completely depopulated. The extent of the destruction, however, is difficult to ascertain. Salamis, for example, had not been completely destroyed if in 123 C it received the title of metropolis, and one should be careful not to identify automatically all extant evidence as a consequence of the uprisings. Trajan's sending a colony to Libya, for example, and Hadrian's edict in favor of Egyptian peasants, are not necessarily to be regarded as consequences of Jewish uprisings, and it cannot be excluded that they should be linked to a situation antecedent to the Jewish uprisings. The revolt in Mesopotamia. A Jewish rebellion in Mesopotamia is not mentioned by Dio but is reported in Eusebius Chronicon, whereas Eusebius' history records only the suspicion of the emperor that the Jews in Mesopotamia would also attack the inhabitants. Concerning the Roman reaction, however, all the Christian sources agree that Trajan ordered one of his most famous generals, Lucius Quietus, to fight harshly against the Jews. He organized a force and murdered a great number of the Jews there. A passage of the St/Id lexicon may also refer to these events. Although, in the account of Dio, no mention is made of a Jewish revolt in Mesopotamia, mention is made of a rebellious movement against Roman rule that occurred in the summer of 116, probably before September, when Trajan left for a voyage to the Persian Gulf. One of the generals charged by Trajan with the task of suppressing the revolt was Lucius Quietus. Lucius, in addition to many other successes, recovered Nisibis and besieged and captured Edessa, which he sacked and burned. However, Lucius Quietus is the Roman general also active against the Mesopotamian Jews mentioned by Eusebius. This may account for a possible identification of the Jewish revolt mentioned in Eusebius Chronicon with that of the conquered districts, reported by Dio. Confirmation is seen in Dios establishing a connection between Lucius Quietus and the Jews. When dealing with the Jewish uprisings in other countries, he observes that among others who subdued the Jews was Lucius, who was sent by Trajan. If this identification is correct, the Jewish revolt was an episode of the Parthian War meant to prevent Roman conquest. It was certainly not fortuitous that in Mesopotamia the Jews armed themselves and banded together with the other local population groups. This fact may well be explained by the relatively good position enjoyed by the Jews in the Parthian Empire, at least when compared with that of their brethren under the Roman government. 4. The War of Kitos in Judea. Both Dio and Eusebius report that, after his military operations against the Jews in Mesopotamia, Quietus was elected consul and appointed governor of Judea by Trajan. Arriving in Judea, he may have brought additional military forces, among which perhaps was the vexillatio of the Legio III Cyrenaica, attested in Jerusalem after February 116 C. No details are available concerning the exact happenings, but a War of Kitos is mentioned in Jewish sources. It is dated 52 years after Vespasian's war and 16 before Bar Kochba, and like the earlier and later wars, it was the occasion for the passing of sumptuary legislation and a prohibition against teaching Greek. The different and contradictory versions of the so-called story of Lilianus and Pappus also seem to refer to this war. 30 and perhaps a number of Jewish sources also interpreted as if dealing with the Bar Kochba rebellion. Unrest in Judea is additionally mentioned in two late Syriac sources, stating that the rebelling Jews moved from Egypt and Libya to Judea, where they were destroyed by the Roman armies. The problematic reliability of these late accounts, however, the non-historical character of the Jewish sources, and Dio Cassius and Eusebius' silence concerning the events in Judea, may account for the skeptical positions found in modern scholarship. Military operations occurring in Judea, however, are also mentioned by an unquestionably reliable source, an inscription found in Sardinia, which mentions an expeditio Judea among the other wars fought by Trajan. The events that occurred in Judea in 117, obscure as they are in detail, were, however, serious enough to be responsible for a change in Judea's status from praetorian to consular, and the addition of a second legion, most probably the Legio II Triana, at some point before 120 CE. 35 It may therefore be no accident that Lucius Quietus was elected consul before being sent to Judea. 36 The change in Judea's status remained a permanent one, since after Lucius Quietus, all known governors sent to Judea occupied consular rank. L. Cassonius Gallus, consul in 116 and sent to Judea between 118 and 120 CE, was mentioned in an inscription from Caesarea Maritima, 37 and M. Pacius Gargilius Antiquus, consul suffectus in 119, was confirmed at Dor between 122 and 125. Oppenheimer suggests that changes in the administration of Galilee were made by Hadrian at the beginning of his reign, and that at Sepphoris and Tiberius the administration passed into the hands of non-Jews. V. The interrelationship of the uprisings. The summer of 116 is the one period in antiquity when the Jews in different places in the Diaspora took up arms at approximately the same time. This contemporaneity is outstanding, and it may support the possibility that some kind of concerted plan existed, perhaps with Parthian inspiration. However, no evidence on this subject is available. A link is explicitly mentioned by Eusebius only as regards the revolts of Libya and Egypt, while the possibility that Jews escaping from the repression of Turbo in Egypt moved to Judea, as reported by late Syriac sources, is impossible to substantiate. Horbury is probably correct in arguing that the identification of a common strategic aim is speculative. In each place, the Jews had their own good reasons for fighting. In Mesopotamia, the rebellion seemed to be part of a general movement of local peoples meant to prevent Roman conquest, whereas in Libya, Egypt, and Cyprus the Jewish attacks seemed to be directed not so much against the Roman government as against their Gentile neighbors. 6. Achievements. It is undeniable that the simultaneity of the Jewish uprisings in different places was meaningful because it compelled Trajan to remove military forces led by his best generals from the Parthian front. At the same time, the resistance in Mesopotamia was not yet doomed, as the unsuccessful siege of Hatra demonstrates. The revolt of the conquered districts had been suppressed, but had led to a compromise with the Parthians. It all coincided with Trajan's sickness and death, thus proving decisive in preventing the annexation of Mesopotamia. Brunt may be correct in suggesting that Hadrian's withdrawal from the east may have been necessitated not so much by the situation as by his policy of rejecting imperial expansion, in deliberate contrast to Trajan. In any case, and in spite of the triumph celebrated during the funerals of Trajan, the Parthian War had failed, and the Jews of Babylon had succeeded in remaining outside the Roman Empire. As one finds in the Babylonian Talmud, the Holy One, blessed be He, knows that Israel is unable to endure the cruel decrees of Edom, Rome, therefore he exiled them to Babylonia.